So balcony is a really important part of people's lives. If you're living in a building which you don't have a garden, you've got a balcony. With that, it does also mean that that is an absolutely essential part to get right from a structural point of view. Why? Because we don't want any balcony collapses, but how do you make sure that that structural component is actually correct? It's absolutely essential because we're providing a structural component added to the building that has to meet certain criteria. Obviously, the consequences of not getting that correct can be severe. And so therefore, it's a non-negotiable that you must get that right. How's the best way of getting that right? In our opinion, that is actually moving the production to a much more controlled environment. Building sites are notoriously difficult to control, the quality, the competency, so on. That's much better controlled in a factory environment. But we don't want to be dependent on the people and the way that's manufactured, being dependent on the competency of each individual skill set of a person. So that's where factory process is a really important part, and making sure that you've got a stage-by-stage control process, which makes sure that you're progressively making sure that every part of that balcony is correct, in much the same way as a car would be assembled, or many of these key components which are fundamentally safety, have an impact on safety and our safety in living our lives. And balconies really are no different to this, and that's why we introduced a system which controls each stage of that. It's called Passport, so we've got a digital record, we can trace back and see who assembled what their training was, and so on. That's a really essential part of making sure that your process is right and that the building is going to be safe for residents, not to worry about their structural safety. The second aspect of it is that once you've got the processes right, getting the material selection right and making sure you're using the material selection is equally as important. Why? Because if you don't get the right materials chosen, you're unlikely to have a successful product for the long term. We talk, don't we, about the analogy of a chocolate teapot, for example. In essence, if we're choosing the wrong balcony components there, we've not just got something which is going to fail and always going to fail, but we've got a product which has got a life safety risk attached to that. And so that's why it's really essential that we choose the right components. What does that mean? What is choosing the right components? Choosing the right components is about making sure that the source is credible and that you've got the right checks and processes in place to make sure that that's provided ethically and made sure that it's going to be delivered correct every time. But the second part of that is making sure that the materials are fit for purpose, and that really is where testing and making sure that your product knowledge and your competency as an organisation is continually increasing by doing things like, for example, fire testing and structural testing. We're big believers in structural testing. With that, we have invested a lot of money here in our head office in Reading, where we destructively test all sorts of things. Why? Because that structural integrity depends on us making sure that we've got the knowledge before the event has happened, not after an event has happened. Some of the safety features which we apply in our balconies, one of the initial things is making sure we do loads of testing in the same way as car seats and that sort of thing, in cars themselves, so destructively tested at an early stage before they're brought to market. We've got a very rigorous process, and that's one of our key beliefs in that. During the process though, having multiple different steps and coupling that together with accountability, so key individuals have got accountability, they've got the training and they've got the knowledge, but they're also documenting what is being checked at each stage, is quite a key component. But the second part is not relying on a single area for a key component. For example, one of the key bits of a balcony is where you're connecting a balcony to a building. That connection point is absolutely essential. Now, one thing which we can do is, we've had in place for quite a while, is that we structurally check each one of those welds. So every person who's making a balcony in an off-site location is taking photos of the fabrication, they're uploading them to the quality portal. That then gets checked by a third party. So you've got an independent party checking over that, making sure that's okay. But the other thing we've introduced more recently is AI. So you've got an additional layer of checking, which is identifying potential weak points, potential problems, and we're nipping them in the bud early if they do arise, and they can be rectified long before they even see a construction site, long before they've got any ability to affect this successful outcome. That's one of the reasons why manufacturing a factory and pre-manufacturing balconies is a much more effective system and solution than manufacturing balconies on site, because on site you don't have those same controls and the components are there. You've got the pressures of a building site that could make a big difference to the successful outcome of a balcony, and that's why we're big believers in moving balcony components into a much more controlled environment. So in recent years we've seen a lot of the balcony regulations and regulations across the board being improved, and this is great to see. But fundamentally, our belief is that that process is still a minimum level. Compliance is not a benchmark, it's the basic minimal requirements which we need to actually hit. And so this is where, as an industry, we're really trying to push those boundaries to make sure that, like a car manufacturer would never see an MOT as being the kind of standard for a new car. We're trying to push the balcony industry into that mindset that compliance is not something to shout and brag about, it's the minimum performance you need to hit for a balcony to be even slightly hitting the requirements it needs to. So we're glad to see these regulations improving, but the other component of that is that the mindset across construction, not just balconies but across all the different areas there, needs improving. That it's not that we're trying to hit a standard of compliance, we're going above and beyond that piece. So how do you make sure that a balcony is going to be there for the long term and that you're designing that in an early stage? Well, for us it's quite simple. The first part is any structural component needs to be designed not just to hit the minimum standards, but be there for the long term in terms of corrosion resistance, in terms of long-term fatigue, as we call it in the industry, where the balcony is going to be safe. The critical component points are designed, for example, for 100 years, even though the building is not being designed for 100 years. Now, that's quite key in terms of material selection and the performance criteria. So what makes balconies endure for the long term? Well, one of the most important pieces is the materials which are selected, that they're suitable for the long term. What does that mean? Is that ultimately most buildings in the UK are built to a 60-year design life. But from a balcony component point of view, our belief is that you want to go on the structural components, you want to go more onerous than that. So you're choosing a balcony component which is actually designed for 100 years, for example, because it's a structural critical connection piece. The other thing on that is not just choosing components because they're allowed, even if they're allowed under building regulations, but choosing them because they will be endurable for the longer term. So whether it's colder weather further north into the other environments we work in as well, or where you've got like seafront location and so on, is making sure that you're choosing the right coatings so that the balcony is going to perform not just for a short period of time and look good for the first couple of years, but actually continually do it. The second part of that is making sure that maintenance is easy, and doing that all within the particular balcony, from the balcony which it belongs to, as opposed to accessing a neighbour below to access it and so on. A key part of our design criteria, and really should be across the board. Where you're assembling balconies on site makes that process a lot more difficult because you've got multiple different companies involved in that process. If you're taking that off site and assembling it, it also means that it's easy to take certain components off and replace them, or actually be able to view them by just, for example, lifting a deck board. The learning from incidents which happen is something which all of us in construction need to do well. One of the things which we want to make sure we do as a business is making sure that any incident which happens around the industry generally is actually being learnt from, and the learnings from that can then be part of the thinking and part of the processes and part of the innovations of the future, which actually make things safer, continually safer as we move forward into the future. So really, our key message for the industry is that manufacturing things out of the construction environment in a controlled environment in a factory is a better way of doing it. Why? Because of the process. And the second part, which is absolutely essential as well, is choosing the right materials. And when you've got those two things working in harmony, you've got much safer buildings, which are safer and happier places to live for the residents, where they don't need to worry about the structural integrity and whether their balcony is safe or not.